They said it was a joke. A cabin dug into a hillside with an arched timber entry and a turf roof, and a workbench outside under a lean-to where a man could plane boards in January. The prospector who filed the claim 2 ridges over said the wind always wins. He said no amount of stone or timber changes that. He said come February, the builder would be begging for a bunk in town. The problem wasn't the cold. It was the fuel. In the Bighorn Basin during the 1860s, a man could cut timber all autumn and still run out by March if his cabin bled heat faster than his stove could make it. Then, January showed up. The builder was a middle-aged man with a bad knee that stiffened in deep cold. He worked alone most days, stubborn and quiet, stacking fieldstone for the cheeks of the entry and notching timbers for the arched frame. He had built cattle sheds and hay barns back east, but nothing like this. The dugout-style timbered entry with stacked stone cheeks was his answer to wind. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to was his answer to the question nobody else had asked. Where do you work when the inside is warm and the outside is 20 below? The mockery started in October. A talkative prospector with a cutting way of speaking rode past twice in 1 week, and both times he stopped to watch. He said a man who buries half his cabin is asking for rot and cave-in. He said a workbench outside is for summer, not winter. He said the builder would be hauling frozen tools indoors by December, and the whole experiment would collapse under the first heavy snow. The builder did not argue. He kept stacking stones for the heat shelf that would span the stove area like a ledge, wide enough to hold a row of water jugs and thick enough to soak up heat all evening and give it back all night. He kept the knee wrapped and the pace steady. By late November, the walls were up and the arched timber frame was locked in place, the turf roof thick and settled. The entry faced south, angled to catch sun and shed wind. The stone cheeks funneled air past the door and into a narrow vestibule that kept the main room sealed. Inside, the forge corner workshop vibe was deliberate. Tool pegs on one wall, a low workbench under the window, and the massive heat shelf running the width of the stove area, built from fieldstone he had hauled up the ridge in a handcart. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to ran 12 feet along the west side of the cabin, roofed with split shakes and open on 3 sides. The builder set the workbench at waist height and mounted a small vise on the left end. He built a shallow firebox into the stone cheek of the lean-to, just large enough for a bed of coals to keep the vise and the near end of the bench above freezing. The idea was simple. A man could step outside, work a piece of wood or iron in air cold enough to see his breath, then step back inside to warm his hands without hauling tools through the door. The prospector rode past in early December and laughed out loud. He said the firebox would eat wood faster than the main stove, and the bench would be buried in snow by Christmas. He said the builder was doubling his work for no gain. The builder said nothing. He finished the chimney, mortaring the stones tight and fitting a spark arrestor at the top. A simple iron cap with slots to let smoke out and keep embers in. By mid-December, the cabin was sealed and the stove was running. The builder burned split pine in the mornings and hardwood rounds in the evenings, building coals on the heat shelf that radiated warmth long after the flames died. The turf roof held snow in a thin, even layer that added insulation without loading the frame. The dugout-style entry kept wind from reaching the door. The indoor temperature held steady enough that the builder could sleep without banking the fire high. The knee still stiffened in the cold, but the work was lighter now. Splitting wood, hauling water, cooking simple meals. He kept a jug of water on the heat shelf, and it stayed liquid through the night. He kept his mitts on a peg near the stove, and they dried between trips outside. On calm days, he worked at the covered outdoor workbench lean-to, planing boards for a table or sharpening tools over the small firebox. The vise held iron stock steady enough to file clean edges. The cold kept his hands numb after a few minutes, but the step back inside was 3 paces, not 30, and the warmth hit him immediately. The prospector came by on a clear afternoon in late December and stood in the entry for a moment. He looked at the heat shelf, the tool pegs, the window with frost only on the outer pane. He said it was warmer than he expected, but he said the real test was still coming. He said a cold snap in January would find every weak spot in the build, and a cabin this tight would fill with smoke if the chimney ever clogged. He said the builder was 1 spark arrestor freeze-up away from sleeping outside. The builder said the arrestor was clear, and the chimney drew clean. The prospector said wait for 30 below. He said the wind always wins. Then he left. The builder went back to work. He split a week's worth of firewood and stacked it under the eave of the lean-to where snow couldn't reach it. He patched a hairline crack in the mortar between 2 stones on the heat shelf, mixing fresh mud and sand and pressing it in before it could freeze. He checked the door seals and the window frame. He banked the stove every evening and let the coals fade slow. The system worked. The fuel lasted. The knees stayed loose enough to climb the ladder when he needed to clear the chimney cap of frost. The cold snap hit on the 2nd week of January. The temperature dropped to 20 below, then 30, then lower. The wind came hard from the north, steady and dry, stripping heat from anything exposed. The builders stayed inside most of the day, feeding the stove and keeping the coals deep on the heat shelf. The turf roof shed the wind without flexing. The dugout-style entry blocked the gusts completely. The indoor temperature dropped, but it dropped slow, and the heat shelf kept the air above freezing even when the stove burned low. The builder could still work his hands without gloves when he needed to adjust the damper or add a split log. He kept the firebox in the lean-to cold during the worst of it. There was no point heating the outside when the inside was holding. He went out twice a day to split wood and haul it under the eave, moving fast and keeping his mitts on. The knee ached, but it did not lock. On the 3rd night of the cold snap, the temperature hit 38 below. The builder woke to a cabin full of smoke. He stumbled to the door and shoved it open. Cold air poured in, and the smoke poured out. He pulled his coat on and grabbed the ladder from the side of the cabin. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp. His breath froze in his beard before he reached the chimney. He climbed the ladder slow, favoring the bad knee, and reached the top. The spark arrestor was clogged solid with ice. Moisture from the smoke had condensed in the slots and frozen into a plug that sealed the chimney as tight as a cork. He pulled the arrestor free and knocked the ice off against the stonework. The chimney vented immediately, a column of smoke rising straight into the still air. He fitted the arrestor back in place, tapped it to make sure it seated, and climbed down. Inside, the smoke had cleared. The stove was still going, the coals bright, and the heat shelf warm. He closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for his hands to stop shaking. The crisis had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had come within a breath of killing him. If the chimney had stayed clogged, the cabin would have filled with smoke, and he would have had to choose between freezing outside or suffocating inside. The spark arrestor had done its job keeping embers in, but the cold had turned it into a trap. He sat in the dark for an hour, thinking. The spark arrestor was necessary. Without it, embers could escape and land on the turf roof or the shake roof of the lean-to. But the current design was a failure point. Any night colder than 30 below, and the thing would freeze shut. He needed a version that vented moisture before it could condense, or a version that stayed warm enough to keep ice from forming. By morning, he had a plan. He would rebuild the arrestor with a double cap, the outer cap slotted for draft, and the inner cap solid, except for a center hole. The gap between the caps would let heat from the chimney warm the outer cap enough to keep frost from sealing the slots. It was not elegant, but it was simple, and he could build it at the covered outdoor workbench lean-to without tearing the chimney apart. He spent the next 2 days at the bench, working iron over the small firebox and fitting pieces until the double cap matched the top of the chimney. The cold had eased to 20 below, still brutal, but workable. He kept the sessions short, stepping inside every few minutes to warm his hands over the heat shelf. The vise held the ironwork steady. The firebox kept the metal workable. When the cap was finished, he carried it up the ladder and fitted it in place, sealing the joint with a ring of mortar. The next cold snap came a week later. The temperature dropped to 40 below and stayed there for 2 nights. The builder kept the stove running and the heat shelf loaded with coals. The chimney vented clean. The new arrestor cap stayed clear, the outer slots free of ice, the inner gap warm enough to prevent condensation from freezing. He woke both mornings to a cabin free of smoke, the air clear, and the stove drawing steady. The crisis was solved. The cabin held heat at 69% efficiency, compared to the open dugouts most men built, meaning he burned 1/3 less wood for the same warmth. The knee stayed loose. The water jugs on the heat shelf stayed liquid. On the 3rd morning, he walked outside and found the prospector standing in the entry, staring at the chimney. The man did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said he had seen the smoke venting clean during the coldest night of the winter, and he wanted to know how. The builder explained the double cap. The prospector looked at the covered outdoor workbench lean-to, the vise, the firebox. He said he had been wrong. He said the wind does not always win. He said he would be building a similar setup before spring. Then he left. The builder spent the rest of January and all of February proving the system. He burned less wood than he had cut, and by March he still had 1/4 of his stack left. The heat shelf worked exactly as planned, soaking up warmth during the evening burn and radiating it back through the night. The turf roof held its insulation value, even when the snow melted and refroze. The dugout-style entry never let wind reach the main room. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to became the most used part of the build. He planed boards for a table, sharpened every tool he owned, and repaired a broken hinge on the door, all without hauling cold iron and wood through the cabin. The small firebox burned a few sticks of kindling per session, barely a dent in the overall fuel budget. The vise held work steady even when his hands were too cold to grip tight. He built a second table, a chair, and a small chest for storage, working through the coldest part of winter in air that would have shut down any indoor workshop. The day that changed everything was the day he hung his damp mittens in the attic space above the main room and found them dry by evening. That was the turning point. The attic was not heated directly, but the warmth rising from the heat shelf was enough to dry wool without scorching it. It meant the cabin was not just holding heat, it was managing moisture, and that was the difference between a shelter and a system. Word spread slow, but it spread. By late February, 3 families from the Basin had stopped by to look at the build. They asked about the heat shelf, the entry design, the lean-to. They asked how much wood he burned per week and whether the knee could handle the ladder work. The builder answered plainly. He did not sell the idea or defend it. He showed them the chimney, the arrestor cap, the fieldstone work. He let them step inside and feel the warmth. One man asked if he could copy the design. The builder said yes. Another man asked if the turf roof would hold through spring melt. The builder said it had so far. A third man asked about the covered outdoor workbench lean-to and whether the firebox was worth the trouble. The builder walked him outside and showed him the vise, the bench, the stack of finished work. The man nodded and said he would build one before next winter. By April, 7 families had started similar builds, some with turf roofs and some with sod, some with arched entries and some with straight lintels, but all with heat shelves and all with covered lean-tos for outside work. The Basin had found a system that worked, and it had come from a man with a bad knee who refused to waste fuel. The prospector came by one more time in early March. He did not mock. He did not argue. He said he had started his own build 2 ridges over, using the same heat shelf design and a similar entry. He said he was copying the covered outdoor workbench lean-to because it made sense, and he was tired of freezing his hands every time he needed to sharpen an axe. He said the builder had proven something the valley needed to see, which was that a man could live through a Wyoming winter without burning his entire woodlot or sleeping in town. He said the double cap arrestor was the detail that sold him, because it meant the system could survive the nights that killed everything else. Then he rode off. The builder went back to work. He had proven the concept, and the concept was simple. Mass holds heat, entries block wind, and a covered workspace extends the range of winter work without compromising the indoor climate. The physics were not new. The application was. Most men built cabins as 4 walls and a roof, then fought the cold with fire. The builder had designed the structure to work with the heat, storing it, reflecting it, and keeping it close. The result was a fuel efficiency of 69% and a livable winter at 50 below. The technique did not last. By the time modern heating arrived in the Basin, the old builds had been abandoned or modified beyond recognition. The heat shelves were torn out to make room for iron stoves that burned hotter and faster. The turf roofs were replaced with shake or tin. The covered lean-tos were enclosed and turned into sheds. The knowledge faded because it was no longer necessary, and because the men who built the original systems did not write them down. But for one winter in the 1860s, the hobbit-burrow cabin with the covered outdoor workbench lean-to was the standard against which every other build was measured. It survived 38 below with a clogged chimney and came out clean. It proved that mass and design could beat fire and luck. It changed the way 7 families built, and it did it without a single page of written instruction. That was the part people missed. The builder did not invent new physics. He applied old physics in a way that made sense for the location, the fuel supply, and the winter. The arched entry blocked wind. The stone cheeks funneled air. The heat shelf stored warmth. The lean-to extended the workspace. The double cap arrestor kept the chimney clear. Every piece solved a problem, and every problem had been tested in conditions that would have killed a lesser build. The spring melt came in late March. The turf roof shed water without leaking. The entry drained clean. The heat shelf cooled slowly as the stove use dropped off, but it stayed warm enough through April that the builder could still dry mitts overnight if he needed to. He spent the warm months cutting timber for the next winter, splitting and stacking it under the eave of the lean-to, where it would season through summer. He repaired the mortar joints that had cracked during the freeze-thaw cycles, mixing fresh mud and pressing it in before the heat could dry it too fast. He cleared the chimney and inspected the double-cap arrestor, finding it sound and free of rust. The knee had loosened with the warmer weather, but it still ached on cold mornings, a reminder that the next winter would come and the system would be tested again. By June, the basin was green and the snow was gone, but the memory of 38 below was still fresh. The families who had copied the build were finishing their own versions, raising arched entries and stacking stone for heat shelves. The prospector's cabin was nearly done, a low-slung structure with a turf roof and a lean-to that matched the builder's almost exactly. The valley had learned. The next winter tested the repairs. The temperature dropped to 42 below in January, the coldest night on record for the basin. The builder woke to a cabin that was cool but breathable, the heat shelf still radiating warmth, the chimney venting clean, the double-cap arrestor held without icing. The entry blocked the wind. The turf roof shed the cold. He spent the day inside, feeding the stove and keeping the coals deep, and by evening the indoor temperature had climbed back to comfortable. The system had survived the worst the basin could throw at it, and it had done it without modification. That was proof. The prospector stopped by the next week and said his own cabin had held through the same night, and that 3 other families had reported similar results. He said the valley owed the builder a debt, though he did not say what kind. The builder said the valley owed him nothing. The design was free to copy and free to modify. He had built it because the old way did not work and the new way made sense. That was enough. By the spring of the second year, the covered outdoor workbench lean-to had become standard across the basin. Men who had laughed at the idea in the fall were building their own by March, adding vises and fireboxes and roofing them with shake or thatch. The heat shelf design spread slower because it required more stone and more labor. But the families who built them reported the same results. Less wood burned, more heat retained, and no smoke-filled nights when the temperature dropped. The builder's cabin became a reference point. Visitors came from as far as 2 days' ride to see the arched entry, the turf roof, and the massive stone shelf that spanned the stove area. The builder showed them everything. He walked them through the entry, explained the airflow, and let them feel the warmth radiating from the shelf. He showed them the double-cap arrestor and explained why it worked. He took them to the covered outdoor workbench lean-to and demonstrated the firebox, the vise, and the workflow that let a man work outside in January without losing his fingers. He did not charge for the education. He did not ask for credit. He simply shared what he had learned, and the valley took it from there. The third winter was quieter. The builder had refined the system to the point where it required almost no adjustment. He burned the same amount of wood, kept the same schedule, and maintained the same indoor temperature. The knee had adapted to the cold, or he had adapted to the knee. Either way, the pain was manageable, and the work was routine. He spent more time at the covered outdoor workbench lean-to, building furniture for trade, and repairing tools for neighbors. The firebox burned clean, and the vise held tight. The workspace had become an extension of the cabin, a place where cold air and warm shelter met without conflict. That was the innovation people remembered. Not the heat shelf, not the turf roof, not even the double-cap arrestor, but the simple idea that a man could work outside in winter if he had the right setup. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to proved it, and the Basin copied it. And by the fourth winter, there were a dozen versions scattered across the valley. Each one slightly different, but all built on the same principle: shelter the workspace, warm the tools, and keep the transition short. The technique faded when coal stoves arrived in the Basin. The new stoves burned hotter and required less tending, and the heat shelves became obsolete. Men tore them out to make room for the iron boxes, and the stone was repurposed for foundations or walls. The turf roofs were replaced with shake because shake was easier to repair and did not require seasonal maintenance. The covered lean-tos were the last to go because they still made sense even with modern heating. But eventually, they were enclosed and turned into sheds or torn down completely. By the turn of the century, the builder's cabin was empty, the heat shelf cold, the chimney capped. The valley had moved on. But for a decade in the 1860s and 70s, the system had worked. And it had worked well enough that 7 families survived winters they might not have otherwise. That was the measure. Not whether the technique lasted, but whether it solved the problem it was built to solve. The builder had answered a question nobody else was asking, and the answer had kept people alive. That was enough. The builder left the Basin in the spring of 1878. The knee had stiffened to the point where ladder work was no longer safe, and the winters were getting harder to manage alone. He sold the cabin to a young family from the east who planned to run cattle on the upper ridge. They kept the heat shelf for 1 season, then tore it out to make room for a larger stove. They kept the covered outdoor workbench lean-to longer, using it as a staging area for gear and supplies. But eventually, they enclosed it and turned it into a storage shed. The arched entry was the last original feature to survive, and it lasted until the cabin was abandoned in the 1890s. By then, the design had been copied, modified, and forgotten. A brief answer to a specific problem in a specific place. The builder never wrote it down. He never drew plans or kept records. He built it, tested it, shared it, and moved on. That was the frontier method. Solve the problem in front of you. Prove it works. Then let the next man improve it or replace it. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to was one answer. There were others, but for a handful of winters in the Bighorn Basin, it was the answer that worked. The physics did not change. Thermal mass still holds heat. Stone still radiates warmth. Insulation still slows heat loss. The principles the builder used in the 1860s were the same principles engineers would later formalize in textbooks. But he did not need textbooks. He needed a warm place to sleep and a workspace that did not freeze his hands. And he built both using materials he could haul and tools he could swing. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to was not a monument. It was a solution. It worked because the design matched the need. And the need was simple: extend the range of winter work without compromising the indoor climate. The firebox kept the vise warm. The roof kept the snow off. The short step kept the builder from losing heat on the transition. That was all it took. The valley copied it because the valley needed it, and when the valley no longer needed it, the valley let it go. That was how frontier innovation worked. No patents, no credit, no legacy. Just a problem, a solution, and the next man who needed the same answer. The last record of the technique appeared in a county surveyor's notes from 1882. He described a series of cabins along the upper basin, most with stone heat shelves and covered work areas. And he noted that the fuel consumption was lower than comparable builds in the lower valley. He did not name the builder. He did not trace the origin. He simply recorded the fact and moved on. By 1890, the notes were filed and forgotten. And by 1900, the cabins themselves were gone, torn down, or collapsed, or absorbed into larger homesteads. The knowledge did not survive because it was not written down. And it was not written down because the men who used it did not see it as knowledge. They saw it as common sense. The kind of thing any competent builder would figure out given enough cold nights and enough split wood. But common sense is not common. It is local, specific, and temporary. It appears when the need is urgent, and it fades when the need is met. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to was common sense for the Bighorn Basin in the 1860s. It was not common sense anywhere else. And it was not common sense for long. The builder died in 1891, far from the Basin, in a boarding house, in a town whose name does not matter. He had worked his last decade as a carpenter and handyman, building stairs and fixing roofs, never mentioning the cabin or the system or the winter that tested both. He left no estate, no children, and no written record of the work that had mattered most. The cabin outlasted him by 3 years, then collapsed under a spring snowmelt that undermined the foundation. The timbers were salvaged for firewood. The stones were scattered. The turf roof became part of the hillside again, indistinguishable from the slope it had once crowned. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to was gone by then, torn down or blown apart, the vise rusted, and the firebox filled with dirt. Nothing remained but the memory, and the memory faded fast. By 1900, the families who had copied the design were telling their children about the old builds, but the details were already blurred. By 1920, the stories were gone. By 1940, the Basin had moved on completely, and the technique was lost. The lesson, if there was one, was this: innovation does not require genius. It requires need, materials, and the willingness to test an idea in conditions that will kill you if the idea fails. The builder had all three. He needed a warm cabin and a winter workspace. He had stone, timber, and a basic understanding of heat. He tested the system at 38 below, and when it failed, he fixed it. And when it worked, he shared it. That was enough to change the valley for a decade, and it was enough to prove that survival innovation is not about invention. It is about application. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to was not new. Lean-tos had existed for centuries. Workbenches had existed for centuries. Fireboxes had existed for centuries. The builder simply combined them in a way that made sense for the location and the climate, and he did it well enough that other men copied it. That was the standard. Not whether the technique was original, but whether it worked. Not whether it lasted, but whether it solved the problem. The builder met that standard, and the valley benefited. That was the end of the story. The Bighorn Basin moved on. Coal replaced wood. Iron stoves replaced stone shelves. Enclosed sheds replaced covered lean-tos. The men who had built the original systems grew old and died, and their children did not build the same way, because the world had changed, and the old answers no longer fit the new questions. That was progress. That was how it worked. But for a brief window in the 1860s, a man with a bad knee had solved a problem that mattered. And he had done it using nothing but stone, timber, and the willingness to climb a ladder at 38 below to knock ice off a chimney cap. That was the part worth remembering. Not the technique, because the technique was gone. Not the builder, because the builder was forgotten. But the principle, that survival, is not about having the best tools or the most knowledge. It is about solving the problem in front of you with the materials at hand, testing the solution until it works, and sharing it with anyone who asks. The covered outdoor workbench lean-to proved it. The valley copied it. The system worked. The end.